Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Joaquin glanced at the alarm clock on the nightstand, its red digits glowing accusingly. 5:30 a.m. With a heavy sigh, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, careful not to wake Sally, who slept peacefully beside him. As he padded softly to the bathroom, Joaquin caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, a testament to the late nights he'd spent poring over bills and bank statements. The stack of unpaid invoices on the kitchen table weighed heavily on his mind. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the worries that clung to him like a second skin. But as he dried off with a threadbare towel, reality came crashing back. They needed money and fast. Joaquin returned to the bedroom where Sally was now sitting up in bed, her tousled hair framing her concerned face. "Another rough night?" she asked, her voice still husky with sleep. Joaquin nodded, sinking down onto the edge of the mattress. "I don't know what we're going to do, Sal. The bills keep piling up, and my job at the factory just isn't cutting it anymore." Sally reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We'll figure something out. We always do." Her words were meant to be comforting, but Joaquin could hear the underlying tension. They'd been scraping by for months, and both knew that something had to give. As if on cue, Sally's eyes lit up with an idea. "You know, I overheard Mrs. Ramirez talking at the supermarket yesterday. She's looking for a new cleaning lady for her big house on the hill. Apparently the pay is really good." Joaquin furrowed his brow. "That's great, but how does that help us? You've already got your hands full with your job at the diner." A mischievous smile played on Sally's lips. "Who said anything about me taking the job?" It took a moment for her meaning to sink in. When it did, Joaquin's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Me? As a cleaning lady?" Sally nodded enthusiastically. "Think about it. You've got those nimble hands from working at the factory, and with a little help, I bet we could transform you into a convincing Maria from Spain." Joaquin opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. They were desperate, and desperate times called for desperate measures. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, mind racing with the possibilities and potential pitfalls. "I don't know, Sal. It's crazy. What if I get caught?" Sally squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We'll be careful. I'll help you with everything, the outfit, the makeup, even some basic Spanish phrases, and just think of the extra money we could bring in." Joaquin looked into his wife's eyes, seeing the hope and determination there. He took a deep breath, making his decision. "All right, let's do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Sally raided thrift stores and discount shops, piecing together an outfit that would transform Joaquin into Maria. She found a floral print dress in muted tones, sensible black shoes, and even a curly black wig that, with some styling, looked surprisingly natural. Joaquin practiced walking in the shoes, his steps initially clumsy and unsure. But as the hours passed, he found a rhythm, learning to take smaller steps and sway his hips ever so slightly. Sally proved to be an excellent tutor, coaching him on everything from applying makeup to adopting more feminine mannerisms. She taught him how to soften his voice and incorporate Spanish words and phrases into his speech. "Remember?" she said as she helped him adjust the wig one final time. "You're Maria from Valencia. You've been in the States for 5 years, working as a housekeeper. You're hardworking, efficient, and discreet." Joaquin nodded, heart pounding as he looked at his transformed reflection in the full-length mirror. The person staring back at him was a stranger, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "You look perfect," Sally said, giving his padded shoulder a squeeze. "Now, let's go get you that job." The drive to Mrs. Ramirez's sprawling mansion was tense. Joaquin, or rather Maria, sat rigidly in the passenger seat, hands folded primly in her lap. Sally glanced over, noting the nervousness in her husband's eyes. "Relax," she said softly. "You've got this. just remember everything we practiced." As they pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate, Joaquin took a deep breath, centering himself. He was Maria now, and Maria was confident and capable. Sally gave his hand one last reassuring squeeze before he stepped out of the car. "Good luck. I'll be waiting right here." Maria smoothed down her dress and approached the intercom by the gate. With a slightly trembling finger, she pressed the button. A crackly voice responded. "Yes?" "Hola, buenos dias," Maria said, her accent pitch-perfect. "I am Maria. I am here about the cleaning position." There was a pause, then a buzz as the gates swung open. Maria walked up the long driveway, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel. The mansion loomed before her, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. The front door opened as she approached, revealing a statuesque woman in her 50s. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her sharp eyes seemed to take in every detail of Maria's appearance. "You must be Maria," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. "I'm Mrs. Ramirez. Please, come in." Maria followed her into a grand foyer, marble floors stretching out beneath her feet. She resisted the urge to gawk at the crystal chandelier overhead or the priceless artwork adorning the walls. "So, Maria," Mrs. Ramirez began, leading her into a tastefully decorated sitting room, "tell me about your experience as a housekeeper." Maria launched into the backstory she and Sally had carefully crafted, speaking of her years of service for wealthy families in Valencia and her more recent work in the States. She emphasized her attention to detail, her discretion, and her willingness to work hard. Mrs. Ramirez listened attentively, occasionally nodding. When Maria finished, she stood up abruptly. "Well, I think I've heard enough. Let's see how you do with a little test, shall we?" For the next hour, Mrs. Ramirez led Maria through the mansion, assigning her various tasks dusting delicate knickknacks, polishing silverware, and even tackling a particularly stubborn stain on the kitchen floor. To Maria's surprise and relief, she found the work came naturally. Her hands, calloused from years at the factory, proved deft at handling fragile objects. The repetitive motions of cleaning were almost meditative, allowing her to fall into a rhythm. As she scrubbed the kitchen floor, Mrs. Ramirez watched with an appraising eye. "Very good, Maria. You're quite thorough." "Gracias, señora," Maria replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "I take pride in my work." When the impromptu test was over, they returned to the sitting room. Mrs. Ramirez settled into an armchair, regarding Maria with a thoughtful expression. "Well, Maria, I must say I'm impressed. Your references were excellent, and you've certainly proved your skills today. The job is yours if you want it." Maria's heart leapt. "Oh, sí, señora. Thank you very much. I would be honored." They discussed the details, hours, pay, and expectations. The salary was even better than Sally had heard, and Maria had to work to keep the excitement from showing on her face. As she left the mansion, contract in hand, Maria felt a mixture of elation and disbelief. She had done it. She, or rather he, had secured the job. Sally was waiting in the car, practically bouncing with anticipation. As soon as Maria slid into the passenger seat, Sally burst out, "Well, how did it go?" Maria broke into a wide grin. "I got the job!" Sally let out a squeal of delight, throwing her arms around her husband. "I knew you could do it! Oh, Joaquin, this is going to change everything for us!" As they drove home, the reality of what they'd done began to sink in. Joaquin had taken on a whole new identity, one he would have to maintain day after day. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Joaquin continued his job at the factory during the day, then transformed into Maria in the evenings to clean Mrs. Ramirez's mansion. It was exhausting work, but the extra income made it all worthwhile. To his surprise, Joaquin found he enjoyed his time as Maria. There was something freeing about stepping into another persona, leaving behind the weight of his own worries and responsibilities for a few hours each day. He took pride in his work as Maria, finding satisfaction in the gleaming surfaces and orderly rooms he left in his wake. Mrs. Ramirez was a demanding employer, but she was also fair and appreciated Maria's hard work. One evening, as Maria was dusting the library, she overheard a heated conversation between Mrs. Ramirez and her son, Antonio. "Mother, you can't keep living in this mausoleum alone," Antonio's voice carried from the study. "It's not safe, and it's far too much work for you to manage." "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," Mrs. Ramirez retorted. "And I have Maria now. She's been a godsend." There was a pause, then Antonio spoke again, his voice softer. "I know you miss Dad, but holding on to this house won't bring him back." Maria quickly moved away, not wanting to eavesdrop further. But the conversation stayed with her, adding a new layer of complexity to her relationship with Mrs. Ramirez. As the weeks turned into months, Joaquin found himself struggling to balance his dual lives. The long hours were taking their toll, and he often felt like he was living in a constant state of exhaustion. Sally noticed the strain, her brow furrowing with concern as she watched her husband drag himself home late each night. "Maybe we should think about scaling back," she suggested one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, going over their much-improved finances. Joaquin shook his head. "We're finally getting ahead, Sal. I can't give that up now." But it wasn't just about the money anymore. Joaquin had come to rely on his time as Maria, finding a sense of purpose and fulfillment in the role that he hadn't experienced in years. As Maria, he was privy to a world he'd never known existed. He listened to Mrs. Ramirez's stories of her late husband, of grand parties and exotic travels. He observed the comings and goings of the wealthy elite who visited the mansion, their conversations a glimpse into a life so different from his own. One day, as Maria was polishing the silver in the dining room, Mrs. Ramirez entered, looking more subdued than usual. "Maria," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "May I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Señora," Maria replied, setting down the polishing cloth. Mrs. Ramirez sank into a chair, gesturing for Maria to join her. "I wanted to thank you for all your hard work these past months. You've been more than just a housekeeper. You've been a comfort to me." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. "Gracias, señora. It has been my pleasure." Mrs. Ramirez's eyes misted over. "My son thinks I should sell this house, move into something more manageable. But this place, it holds so many memories of my George." Without thinking, Maria reached out and patted Mrs. Ramirez's hand. "Your home is beautiful, señora, full of love." Mrs. Ramirez smiled, a rare softness in her expression. "Thank you, Maria. It's nice to have someone who understands." As Maria left that evening, she felt a confusing mix of emotions. The connection she'd formed with Mrs. Ramirez was genuine, but it was based on a lie. For the first time, Joaquin began to question the morality of his deception. The turning point came on a crisp autumn evening. Joaquin had just finished his shift at the factory and was rushing home to transform into Maria. As he hurried down the sidewalk, he collided with a neighbor, Mr. Johnson. "Whoa there, Joaquin!" Mr. Johnson steadied him with a hand on his arm. "Where's the fire?" Joaquin stammered, acutely aware of the wig and makeup hidden in his bag. Just in a hurry to get home." Mr. Johnson's brow furrowed with concern. "You all right, son? You've been looking pretty run down lately. Sally mentioned you've been working a lot of extra hours." Joaquin nodded, anxiety churning in his stomach. "Yeah, just trying to make ends meet, you know." As he continued home, Joaquin's mind raced. How long could he keep up this charade? What would happen if someone found out? That night, after finishing at Mrs. Ramirez's, Joaquin sat at the kitchen table, still dressed as Maria. Sally found him there, staring into space. "Honey?" she said softly, sitting down beside him. "What's wrong?" Joaquin looked at her, his eyes filled with conflict. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Sal. It's not just the exhaustion. I feel like I'm losing myself." Sally reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Oh, Joaquin, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to become such a burden." "That's just it," Joaquin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not a burden. I love being Maria. I love the work, the satisfaction, the connection with Mrs. Ramirez. But it's not real. I'm living a lie, and I don't know how to reconcile that with who I really am." Sally was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe you don't have to reconcile it. Maybe Maria is as much a part of you as Joaquin is." Joaquin looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sally said, squeezing his hand, "that maybe this experience has shown you a side of yourself you never knew existed. You're not just Joaquin pretending to be Maria. You've created a whole person with her own strengths and experiences that came from somewhere inside you." Her words resonated with something deep inside Joaquin. He thought about the satisfaction he felt as Maria, the confidence he'd developed, the empathy he'd cultivated. "So, what do I do?" he asked, feeling lost. Sally smiled gently. "I think that's something you need to figure out for yourself. But whatever you decide, I'm here for you. All of you, Joaquin and Maria." Over the next few weeks, Joaquin grappled with his identity crisis. He continued his work as both Joaquin and Maria, but now he paid closer attention to how he felt in each role. As Joaquin, he felt the weight of responsibility, the pressure to provide for his family, but he also felt the strength of his love for Sally, the pride in his resilience. As Maria, he felt a sense of purpose, a joy in creating order from chaos. He felt compassion for Mrs. Ramirez and a connection to a world beyond his own. Slowly, Joaquin began to see that these weren't separate identities, but different facets of his whole self. The care and attention to detail he brought to his cleaning work as Maria began to influence his work at the factory. The strength and determination he'd always had as Joaquin gave Maria the confidence to speak up and make suggestions to improve the household running. One day, as Maria was preparing to leave after her shift, Mrs. Ramirez called her into the study. "Maria," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice, "I have a favor to ask of you." "Of course, Senora, anything." Mrs. Ramirez took a deep breath. "My son is hosting a charity gala here next week. I was hoping you might consider staying to help during the event. I would compensate you generously, of course." Maria felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. A gala meant more people, more chances to be discovered. But it also meant a chance to be part of something grand, something she'd only ever observed from the sidelines. "I would be honored, Senora," Maria heard herself say. The night of the gala arrived and the mansion was transformed. Glittering decorations adorned every surface, and the air was filled with the sound of classical music and the murmur of sophisticated conversation. Maria moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, refilling champagne glasses and clearing away empty plates. She felt a thrill every time she overheard snippets of conversation about art, politics, and far-off places. As the night wore on, Maria found herself in a quiet corner, taking a moment to catch her breath. She didn't notice Antonio, Mrs. Ramirez's son, approach until he was right beside her. "You must be Maria," he said, his voice warm. "My mother has told me so much about you." Maria felt a jolt of panic, but years of practice kept her expression neutral. "Senor Antonio, it's a pleasure to meet you." Antonio smiled, and Maria was struck by how much he resembled his mother. "I wanted to thank you, Maria. Not just for your help tonight, but for everything you've done for my mother. She seems happier since you started working here." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. "Your mother is a wonderful woman. It's my privilege to work for her." Antonio nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been trying to convince her to downsize for years. But seeing her tonight in this house filled with people and life, maybe I was wrong. Maybe what she needed wasn't less responsibility, but more purpose." As Antonio moved away to greet other guests, Maria stood rooted to the spot, his words echoing in her mind. Purpose. Wasn't that what she'd found here, too? The gala was a resounding success, and as the last guest departed, Mrs. Ramirez found Maria in the kitchen, supervising the cleanup. "Maria," she said, her eyes shining with happiness and a hint of champagne. "I can't thank you enough for tonight. For everything." Impulsively, Mrs. Ramirez pulled Maria into a hug. For a moment, Maria stiffened, afraid her disguise would be discovered. But then she relaxed, returning the embrace. As Maria left that night, she felt a sense of resolution settling over her. The double life she'd been leading wasn't sustainable, but neither was going back to being just Joaquin. The next day, Joaquin sat Sally down for a serious conversation. "I've made a decision," he said, taking her hands in his. "I want to quit my job at the factory and work as a housekeeper full-time." Sally's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure? What about Maria?" Joaquin took a deep breath. "I've realized that Maria isn't just a disguise. She's a part of me, a part I want to embrace. I'm thinking of starting my own housekeeping business, as myself." Sally was quiet for a moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. "I think that's a wonderful idea. But what about Mrs. Ramirez?" Joaquin squeezed her hands. "I'm going to tell her the truth. She deserves to know, and I think she'll understand." The next evening, Joaquin arrived at the mansion not as Maria, but as himself. Mrs. Ramirez answered the door, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she recognized the familiar eyes in an unfamiliar face. "Mrs. Ramirez," Joaquin said, his heart pounding. "I have something I need to tell you." Over the next hour, Joaquin explained everything. The financial struggles, the desperate plan, and most importantly, how the experience had changed him. To his amazement, Mrs. Ramirez listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "Joaquin, or should I say Maria, I won't pretend I'm not shocked, or that I'm not hurt by the deception." Joaquin's heart sank, but Mrs. Ramirez held up a hand. "But I also can't deny the positive impact you've had on my life these past months. You've brought life back into this house and into me." She stood up, pacing the room as she continued. "I admire your courage in coming clean, and I think I understand, perhaps better than you might expect, the complexity of identity." Mrs. Ramirez turned to face him, a small smile on her face. "So, Joaquin, if you're interested, I believe I still have an opening for a housekeeper." Tears of relief and gratitude welled up in Joaquin's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez. I would be honored." As Joaquin left the mansion that night, he felt lighter than he had in months. He was no longer living a double life, but he hadn't lost the parts of himself he'd discovered as Maria. Over the coming months, Joaquin's housekeeping business flourished. Word of his skill and attention to detail spread quickly among Mrs. Ramirez's social circle. He found a balance between the strengths he'd always had as Joaquin and the new abilities he'd cultivated as Maria. Sally supported him every step of the way, helping with the business administration and occasionally teasing him about his newfound love for floral print aprons. 1 year to the day after he'd first transformed into Maria, Joaquin stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom. Sally came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Happy anniversary," she said, resting her chin on his shoulder. Joaquin smiled, meeting her eyes in the reflection. "To Maria?" Sally shook her head. "No, to you, the whole authentic you." Joaquin turned in her arms, pulling her close. As they stood there, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this point. He had taken on a new identity to save his family from financial ruin, but in the process, he'd discovered his true self. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.